Forced adoption practices predate devolution in Wales, but they continue to affect those who experience them, parents, children and wider family members. For many, the feelings of loss, grief, anger and pain remain. At the time when these adoptions took place, many of the women were young, vulnerable and experiencing personal crises. They were not always informed of any legal rights to look after their child themselves or provided with the help that they needed to do so. Some were made to feel inadequate, immoral and undeserving when it came to raising their own babies. Adoption was put forward as the only option because of a lack of financial and other support and the stigma associated with illegitimacy and motherhood out of wedlock. And even now, many of those affected find it extremely difficult to open up and talk about the lifelong heartbreak they've kept to themselves for fear of still being judged. The hurt endured by these historical practices extend beyond the birth mother's relationship with her child. Some children who were adopted in these circumstances have suffered a lifetime of insecurity and anxiety, despite being loved and cared for by their adoptive parents. Some have an ongoing feeling that a part of them is missing and continue to question why their birth parents didn't look after them and bring them up themselves. The grief associated with not knowing who they are is common amongst these children and relates to loss of identity, lack of information about their origins of both birth parents, and for many, including the children of ethnic minority parents, a loss of their wider cultural and ethnic background. While the trauma of forced adoption has been well documented from a mother and child's perspective, the impact on the father is often forgotten. Birth fathers were generally disregarded and blamed for corrupting innocent girls. They had little or no say in what happened to the baby after birth, leaving them feeling helpless and unable to support their partners. They very often became the forgotten characters whose voices were ignored. I therefore want to acknowledge fathers' experiences when it comes to these historical practices too. These practices were unethical, immoral, and may in some cases have been illegal. And I want to put on record today my profound sympathy for all those affected by historic forced adoption. Regardless of the societal pressures or the social norms of the day, such inhumane practice should never have been an acceptable part of our society in Wales. The harm done to these individuals is great, but as a government, we owe them every chance to live the rest of their lives as free from trauma and torment as possible. We cannot change what has happened, but I can provide assurances that adoption legislation and practices have been significantly improved since. Adoption is now only considered when all other options have been fully explored. Services are designed to help birth families stay together whenever that is possible, and when it is not, adoption provides children with safety, stability and the opportunity to thrive. And I would like also to acknowledge and put on record the important contribution adoptive parents continue to make on behalf of children by taking them into their homes and into their hearts. And we, the Welsh Government, are grateful for them for providing the love and support that all children need. Diolch. Thank you. Now, as a government, we are listening to people's experiences and stories to ensure the right support and professional counselling for those affected is readily available. The National Adoption Service has developed a web page specifically those affected by historical adoptions. This provides a host of information relating to adoption support and counselling, access to records and intermediary services. It will also be able to signpost individuals to other services, including peer support and advocacy groups, Welsh Government-funded post-adoption support services and other long-standing non-government service providers. My officials have already begun to work alongside the National Adoption Service to consider the issues outlined within the Joint Committee's report and develop support services which will address the specific needs of those affected by these practices. We've recently held a consultation event involving birth parents affected by historic adoption practices. This provided a safe space to listen and hear views and to inform our service development. We will continue to engage with these mothers as we develop our services. Officials and the National Adoption Service have started scoping the regulatory changes that could be introduced in Wales to support the issues related to the shortage of counsellors able to provide post-adoption support, alongside considering our intermediary services. We're also committed to fully exploring with those affected the key challenges they face with regard to adoption records, and we're currently scoping what an improved national access to record service for those affected by these historical practices could look like in Wales. As we face future challenges, we will remember the lessons of family separation and continue to protect the fundamental rights of children and the importance of their right to be cared for by a parent. That is why, as part of our work to radically reform children's service in Wales, we are committed to continuing to develop services that can support vulnerable families to stay together. I would like to convey my deepest sympathy and regret to all those affected that due to society failing you, you've had to endure such appalling historical practices in Wales. And for this, the Welsh Government is truly sorry.
Gareth Davies.
Deputy Llywydd, and could I firstly thank you, Deputy Minister, for bringing forward today's statement on historical adoption practices, which follows the Joint Committee on the Human Rights Inquiry into the experience of unmarried women and their children who were adopted during the 1950s, 1960s and 1970s. As you mentioned in your statement, Minister, many historical adoption practices were unethical, immoral and in many cases illegal. In addition to this, these practices continue to impact many who experience them, and also for many, the feelings of loss, grief, anger and pain remain. This really was an utterly horrific situation, and one that should not have occurred and must never happen again. In light of this, Minister, and on this side of the Chamber, the Welsh Conservative Senedd Group would like to identify with the apology that has been made by the Welsh Government today. Many people will be able to sympathise with the devastating impact that these forced adoptions caused. And being a father of 2 children myself, it would be a pain that would be never-ending. And Deputy Minister, if I may, I'd like to raise a few questions with you regarding your statement today. You said, Deputy Minister, that many who underwent adoption practices were not always informed of any legal rights to look after their children themselves, or provided with the help that they needed to do so. Of course, this is extremely concerning, Deputy Minister, so could I ask what work is now being undertaken to ensure all those liaising with adoption practices are informed of their legal rights? And secondly, Deputy Minister, you say some children who were adopted in these circumstances have suffered a lifetime of insecurity and anxiety, despite being loved and cared for by their adopted parents. In light of this, Minister, what further work is being carried out to ensure those who have been impacted are fully supported? And finally, Deputy Minister, you mentioned that a consultation event was recently held involving birth parents affected by historic adoption practices. Could I welcome this consultation and ask if any initial assessment has been made from this initial consultation and whether any more will be carried out in the near future? And to reiterate what I stated at the beginning of my response, I'd like to thank you for bringing forward today's statement, and I reiterate our support for your actions this afternoon. Thank you.
I thank the member very much for his contribution, and thank you for associating yourself with the apology that I've given on behalf of the Welsh Government today. That is very much appreciated. Obviously, you raised some very important points. We are working to make sure that children who are adopted now and mothers of children who are adopted, parents of children who are adopted, are fully aware of their legal rights and have the opportunity to have the support and professional advice that they need. Adoption is, as I said in my speech, now considered as the last resort, and that every effort is made to keep children with their families and to give support to them at home. And that is why we've got the programme, as you know, about of trying to radically transform children's services, that puts in so much support to try to keep children in their families and in their communities. The point about adopted children often experiencing insecurity and anxiety is something that has been well recorded, and we do put in resources for post-adoption support. There's a considerable amount of post-adoption support now going on in Wales. In fact, I think in the barometer, where it's listed how different parts of the UK are managing their services, Wales does score very high in terms of the support it gives to families in Wales. So we do have specifically post-adoption services that are dealing with the trauma, because I think in the past we thought, right, you have an adoption order and that's it, and everybody lives happily ever after. But obviously that's not true. I mean, it is basically a lifetime, really, of coming to terms with the trauma that may have happened before, and for dealing with the feelings that have resulted as a result of, not knowing sometimes what your origins were, and also the stress that has been left with the mothers and the other people involved whose babies weren't given up for adoption, they were taken. And then finally, the consultation. We have set up a consultation group which is made up of people with lived experience of these practices, and we hope that this will form a permanent group that we can work with, so that our responses will be geared to what is wanted and what is needed. So we want to be sure that we bring people who are aware of what actually happened to them and the effect this had on their lives, so that we can respond in the strongest way possible. Thank you very much for the support.
Thank you, Dear Prylwyd, and thank you to the Deputy Minister for this very important statement. This is something that forces us to reflect on the importance of having our own Senedd here in Wales, that we can put right some of the wrongs of the past and to give that important apology. They are small words and easy to say, but it's so difficult, and people have had to fight so hard, and we know that the UK government continues to be of the view that there isn't a need for this kind of apology, but it's important that we do acknowledge what has happened in the past, and I'd like to associate myself and Plaid Cymru with your apology and your comments today. This is an important moment, an important statement, and I hope it'll give some comfort to those people who are suffering trauma and ongoing suffering. It won't put right what has been done. It's not going to remove that trauma, but certainly having that recognition that they deserve an apology is very important indeed, and I'm pleased and proud to see this happening in our national parliament. Certainly it was an important moment to see Scotland doing this, and there are a number of lessons to be learnt. I'm sure we will have all met people who have suffered because of this cruel policy, and it was cruel. It was cruel to everyone involved, and it's very important that things are different now, and it's good to have an assurance from the Deputy Minister that things are now different and that we have learnt those lessons, but certainly this is something that we need to keep a close eye on in an ongoing manner, and to ensure that all necessary support is available to any family or individual in that difficult situation. The one thing I would like to see, and I saw in your statement, and I would like some clarity in terms of the support that will now be available, because clearly hearing the apology could actually bring up all of these feelings in many, many people. And you refer to counselling. Now, the Scottish Government had declared £145,000 specifically to provide specialist support and counselling for those affected. So may I ask whether there is specific funding in place in order to support this, or how do you intend to ensure that that support is available? Because clearly many people will be listening to your statement today, and it would be good to have an assurance in terms of how they can access that support. So that's my only question, but thank you for this. As I say, it's an important moment for us, Senedd, and I'm very proud to see the Welsh Government doing this today.
Thank you very much for that contribution, and for the Association of Plaid Cymru with the apology. I'm very grateful for that, and I think it's really important that we are united across the whole of the Senedd in supporting this apology, and we do hope that this apology in itself will bring some relief to the people who I know have campaigned for so long in order to get an apology. And it is good that we have devolution and we can make that decision here, and we've decided that we must formally apologise to the people who have let us know what it has meant to them all these years, these historical practices that were so poor. And I think Heledd Buchan is absolutely right in saying that this was a cruel policy, and we should recognise that now. And it is different now. We have learned lessons, but we do have to keep a watching brief and seeing exactly what is happening. And I hope that we have got that built into the system in order to keep that watching brief. In terms of what we will be able to provide, there is a shortage of counsellors, and we are looking at ways of perhaps changing the regulations in order to be able to get more counsellors available. But we are doing all this in consultation with the group that we've set up. So I'm not really able to say that we will do something specific or spend a specific amount of money, because we want to do it co-productively with people who have actually got the lived experience. As I said in response to the earlier question, Wales has got a good record on post-adoption support now, because we have put considerable resources into it. So we do have places to direct people, but we do hope that by making this public apology, by making it as public as we possibly can, that it will reach those people who haven't actually been in the campaigns, but have been, having this secret, for years and years, and not being able to have the opportunity to express it. So I hope we are going to reach some of those people, and obviously we will have to respond to any requests that we actually get. But I think the apology in itself is very important, but I know that it does lead to the need to do other things.
Jenny Rathbone.
Thank you very much for your leadership on this matter. Thank you very much for your leadership on this really painful matter. Reflecting on when I was a young woman in the 60s and 70s, I can genuinely say I did not know about this. I was a very misbehaving radical woman. Had I known, I would have done something about it. Instead, I was campaigning for women's rights to choose. These women had no choice, and it is certain that these practices were unethical, immoral, and almost certainly an abuse of their human rights. I think we have to ask ourselves, how is it that these organisations that have suppressed this information from the wider public for some 30 years, it was really only in the 80s and 90s that these issues started to be aired in public. And what were the bystanders to all that was going on doing? Why did they not speak out? These are things we absolutely have to ask ourselves. In terms of the mitigation that you are endeavouring to rectify in relation to the harm done to these women and mothers and fathers as well as their children, it seems to be absolutely urgent that people need to meet their parents before they die. And therefore, it is essential that we accelerate the process of enabling people to see their records and given every help to try and track down their relatives. So I heard you say that you were thinking of changing the regulations. Alleluia, let's do that, because these people have got to have some justice, some closure on what is an appalling event that will have dogged them for all their lives.
I thank Jenny Rathbone for those contributions. The Joint Committee on Human Rights, if you read their report, it does give some of the history of what has happened and how it happened. So that is very worth reading. We are starting to look at whether we could have a Wales-wide way of getting access to records, because we do hear some quite distressing stories about the difficulty of getting access to records, of how it often takes them a long time, and the support is not always there for when people actually do access those records. So we are certainly looking at that. And with new adoption practices, we are trying to ensure that adoptive young people and children are able, if it is at all possible, if they are adopted, to keep contact with their first families. Because having, spoken and known many adoptive young people, they do want to have that link, and they, if we're able to build it in a more natural way, right from the beginning, if it's not possible for the children to live at home with their families, and adoption is the best option, if we can build in adoption with contact with their first families, I think that is what we are moving towards. And I think this is quite common in some other countries, much more common than it is here, because we want to move away from the situation where everything is done in a cloak of secrecy, and where it is possible, we want that contact to be there, so we don't have the situation of people, striving to make contact with their parents and not being able to reach them. So I think there are a lot of practical things we can do that will make it much easier for people in this situation. And we are absolutely committed in the Welsh Government to doing all we possibly can and to relieve the utter distress that has been caused by these practices that took place some years ago.
Jane Dodds.
I'd like to pay tribute to those people affected by this absolutely abhorrent practice. I pay tribute to the poise and dignity that you have all brought to this debate and this discussion. And I'm sure we all humbly stand here, really in awe of you, but also in shame of what happened in the past. As leader of the Welsh Liberal Democrats and as chair of the cross-party group on children, I associate myself with the apology, and I thank you for that. I can see how important it is to this government, with the First Minister here in the Chamber and many members of the Cabinet as well, associating themselves with the Welsh Government and the Welsh people's position on apologising to those people affected. I cannot imagine the horrors that you went through, and I thank you that you brought this to our attention, and I thank you that as survivors of this, we need to be constantly reminded of what has happened in the past and how we can improve it for the future. Thank you. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you very much, Jane, for associating the Liberal Democrats with this apology. So that means that all the parties in the chamber are thoroughly behind this apology. So I think that this is just obviously the beginning of the work that we're going to do on this issue, but I think it is very important, that we finally acknowledge that what happened to those young women, so many years ago, that we don't forget that. We don't forget the terrible upset they went through in terms of having a baby born to you, wanting to keep it, and having it taken away from you, and it being accepted as being the norm of the time. We must never ever let anything like that happen again. And I'm very pleased that the Welsh Government is able to apologise today and commit itself to doing all we possibly can in the future to help.
And finally, Joyce Watson.
And I, like Jane, want to express my admiration for the bravery that the women who have brought this forward have demonstrated, because that's not easy, and it was necessary. That's the issue. When we're talking about 50s, 60s and 70s, we're not really talking that long ago. My children were born in the 70s, and I cannot, and I was a young mother myself, I cannot imagine the pain and the heartache that those women were going through. I had a friend who did go through that, and she never got over it, ever. And she didn't know where her child was and how that child was faring. And her parents thought they were doing the right thing, because the stigma that she would have experienced, so they believed, was greater than the loss of her child. Of course they were wrong, but they did it for the right reasons. She told me her story many decades ago about loving her son, about knitting things so that they could go with him, about buying toys, and about the huge wrench, the loss, when that child left the room for the last time. And she lived with that. And so I knew about it really from the 80s. So I don't think, that society served anybody well here, because it wasn't just the mothers and the fathers that have been mentioned, but it was the whole family, the family who were forced in a way to do what they thought was the right thing for their daughters, and all the stigma that went with that. And of course the state was involved, the state could have helped, they could have supported financially if they'd chosen to do that, instead of stigmatising young women, and sometimes not always young women, but just women who weren't married, who didn't fit a norm. So I commend you today, and everybody in here will support you in giving that apology. What we can do moving forward for those women and their children, and there will be grandchildren now as well, is hugely important.
Yeah.
Thank you, Joyce, for those words. And I think Joyce does remind us that this was not long ago, really, when this happened, and you were talking about the 80s. So it's not very long ago at all. And also to remind us that there are grandchildren. So there's a whole mass of people, who have been affected by this, and the effects will go on for a long time. So once again, thank you very much for the support given here in the Senedd today, and thank you above all to those people, some of whom are here with us in the gallery today, for campaigning and bringing this to the attention of us, of the public, of the government. And once again, the Welsh Government is deeply sorry.